Norman had spent the morning practicing small, benign acts of ritual the way other people practiced piano scales. He adjusted his spectacles until they sat on the exact spot of his nose where he could neither ignore them nor be slowed by them. He blew a decisive breath into his hands and rubbed the ink out of his fingers as if he could make the blotches of recent days evaporate. And he put the tiny stapler on the desk face up as an ornamental sentinel. The stapler had been with him through a dozen memos and 2 family disgraces. It reassured him by being steadfast and small. He calculated with an anxiety that had the shape of a ledger, the kind of thing that might save the world. The department smelled of paper and tepid kettle water and something faintly metallic like the echo of a stamp hitting its pad. Outside, continents hiccuped like the world had swallowed a laugh and couldn't quite spit it out. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights made a soft, bureaucratic prayer. Norman gathered the team at his desk in the kind of silence that prefaces both funerals and surprise parties. Rita had brought a thermos of coffee, and a binder so full of grievances it made a soft rustling, like a bet being placed. Gideon, who never left his station for anything less than a network anomaly or a very good line of code, had come with a cable looped like a noose of practicality. Ajra hovered at the corner of the cluster like a folding weather vane that wasn't entirely sure which wind to follow. "Here," Arya said, laying a packet of forms in the center of the desk with the solemnity of a priest setting out communion wafers. 3 copies. Triplicate. Chromatically stamped, notarized signatures witnessed, sealed, in that order, no improvisation. Norman knew the list by heart, had rewritten it in the margins of his life. He looked at the forms, and the words blurred for a second. Not for lack of comprehension, but because the thing he was about to do was both wholly banal and impossibly consequential. The Armageddon protocol had been activated because an obsolete stamp, a sandwich, and an out-of-date checklist performed a tiny, unglamorous ballet across a conveyor belt. The revocation required a melody equally unlikely, a signature from someone very important, a body of human testimony, and a symbolic continuity of meaning. Symbolic, in department terms, meant legally inscrutable and therefore untrustworthy. "We need a seal," Rita said simply. "Someone with authority. A witness outside the department." And she unrolled her binder like a talisman. "We need to present it like a precedent. We have precedent of a sort," Gideon said. "We have marginalia. We have a clause in the basement ledger that marginalia is rarely persuasive in formal hearings." Auditor Primus' voice came through the intercom like a metronome set to disapproval. The figure of Primus was not physically present. That would have been dramatic. Instead, he arrived in layers, an official memo stamped in triplicate, a faint smell of ozone and the soft, legal hiss of his displeasure. "Precedent requires clarity. We will be monitoring the filing intake. Any deviation will be recorded." As if we planned deviation, Arya returned, and for the first time a small, human crack appeared in her severity. She pinched the bridge of her nose as though trying to press the day's anxieties back into sensible shape. "We will comply." "We will," she looked to Norman, who felt as though the world's eyes had converged on his ink-stained fingers. "You will deliver the forms," she said. "We deliver them together," Norman corrected before he could stop himself. The word felt like an improper clause a clerk had added out of mere humanity. The plan was so absurdly, necessarily theatrical that it would have made a playwright suspicious. They would assemble the forms, obtain the signature, and physically file them in triplicate before the final clause of the activated Armageddon became irrevocable. That meant staging a procedural symphony. Gideon would engineer a slight extension of the intake window by coaxing an ancient scheduling daemon into allowing 3 extra minutes. Hull would orchestrate a diversion by noticing a suspicious bag by the directorate elevators. Rita would mobilize a human shield of union clerks with clipboards and righteous noise. Arya would produce a policy memo that read as if it had been written to support normative order. while Azra would provide the one kind of marginalia the directorate had trouble classifying, literal translations of ancient clerkly doodles that shadowed precedent. And Mr. Enoch would do whatever Enoch always did, which involved mopping the corridors and occasionally offering impossible wisdom about the rightness of small acts. They began with office supplies. Norman, who had spent his career underestimating the persuasive power of a golden paperclip, produced two from behind a stapler and placed them ceremonially on the forms. "A signature needs a witness that isn't a clerk," he said. "It needs the sense that this is not merely us." Azra tilted his head, and after watching the arrangement of paper and stationery as if it were a constellation, plucked a paperclip between two sparkling fingertips. "It will be more persuasive if you call it a relic," he observed. "Relics are always persuasive. They smell of meaning." "You are not allowed to invent religious language in a formal filing," Arya said automatically, and then made the adjustment with the speed of a woman trained to turn every impulse into a memo. "Call it an emblem. It is an emblem." They needed marginalia to satisfy someone very important's demand for unarguable human goodness. Marginalia in department terms was a dangerous thing, subjective, rooted in personal annotation, and therefore wildly unsanctioned. But there were margins everywhere, in Gideon's log files, in the faded charter ledger downstairs, in the notes Norman preserved between stanzas of poems. Azra hunched over the brittle page from the department's founding ledger, tracing faded annotations with a finger that left tiny arcs of confetti where it moved. This curve here was a clerk's idea to authorize remedial acts when chaos was nascent, Azra murmured. They drew a little boat. People used to draw boats when they were making an exception. It meant they intended a safe passage. Norman found a notation he had written years ago, a line under a policy that read, in his small, undecorated hand, "People are not forms." He had underlined it twice and circled the tiny, childish doodle of a stapler he'd drawn after losing an important memo. He felt oddly shy about someone seeing his marginalia, as if revealing his underlinings would reveal the secret of his humanness to a machine that could not absorb it. "You think an administrator will be persuaded by a doodle?" Rita asked. "Someone very important is not uninventive," Azra said. "They are merely bored by straight legalism. They like to be nudged toward a human argument. Consider the biscuit. The biscuit, an actual, slightly overbaked, margarine biscuit from Ritus Thermos, became a totem. Norman wrapped it carefully in a department seal and addressed it to the signee with a small note, evidence of imperfect kindness. Arya's pen hovered over the note, as if it were an act of disobedience. Then she added a subscript. Exhibit A. Tum's role was to provide the witness testimony that would be accepted as non-departmental. He had rehearsed, practiced the right cadences, and memorized a set of truths that were both confessional and plausibly outside the department. At the door he stopped, hands in his pockets, and did the unexpected thing. He turned back and took Norman's hand in a quick, friend-making squeeze. "Do it gently," he said, and then let go, his smirk gone for a second, replaced by something like an honest boy's fear. "The risk is catastrophic," Norman said. He spoke to the group, but his voice was an inward accounting. "If we fail well. If we win, we do so badly and humanly." They walked to the 7th atrium like conspirators at a PETA meeting. The atrium was austere in a way only architecture designed by lawyers could be. Columns that resembled rolled-up memos, a ceiling painted in audit-friendly gray, and the receptionist sphinxes that asked questions in forms so old they predated sarcasm. Gideon's forged itinerary, technically accurate and artistically imaginative, facilitated a landing in the waiting room, where someone very important took their tea, with the air of someone who had never been surprised by any argument, despite a long career in being unsurprised. Someone very important looked less like an avatar of omnipotence, and more like a very tired person with a good biscuit and a prejudice in favor of precedent. They had a cardigan the color of off-white policy memos and a ring of keys that clinked like lost revenues. We are here to request signature under Clause C, subsection 112b, with supportive testimony and marginalia, area said, phrasing the petition as if it were a clause of scripture. Someone very important took their biscuit, considered Norman's handwritten marginalia folded carefully beneath it, and then asked, "Why should I sign?" Norman had rehearsed legalistic appeals and existential pleas. None felt true. He turned, suddenly, to the thing he had underlined in his own hand those many years ago. "Because people are not forms," he said, and then, softer, "because someone once gave me a stapler when I had nothing. Because my sister kept a file for me even when I forgot to file myself. Because yesterday a midwife in a town you have never heard of improvised a delivery with a shoelace and a prayer. And she sang a lullaby afterward that was not on any form. Because we are messy and we are brave in our mess." The Signey's eyebrows, oddly expressive for someone who had spent a life tamping down expression, arched. They looked at the marginalia, at the biscuit, at Rita's binder, at Tom's honest, nervous face. They listened to the janitor's parable, whispered under the breath of the waiting room, which seemed to snag their attention in a way that technical arguments did not. "And you will accept precedent if I sign?" the Signey asked. "We will accept consequences," Norman said. "We will be asked to explain ourselves. We will be expected to set an example. We will be accountable." That last line, accountability, rather than immunity, was the thing that tilted the Signey. They had spent a life avoiding signs that an exception was an abuse. Norman's promise to accept the messy paperwork of consequence felt, absurdly, like an ethical form of courage. The Signey set down their biscuit, took a pen with a ceremonious slowness, and signed. The handwriting was not ornate. It was practical, like every other bureaucratic thing that nevertheless managed to change the shape of the world. They added a small marginal note of their own, half a sentence, half a verdict, and slid the forms back. "File them now," the Signey said. "And do be careful with the sealing." It was Mr. Enoch who produced the brass handle mop. He had been mopping outside the atrium, humming that odd lullaby that could have been 6 notes or 13 centuries old. When asked what to do about sealing, he smiled as though he had always known. He drew the mop from behind a pillar and tapped the handle lightly against the forms. The brass made a noise like a conclusion. "Use what you have," he said. "Use what's honest." They used the mop as a symbolic seal. Rita's union clerks formed a respectful ring, their clipboards held like shields. Hall, who had staged the diversion so that directorate clerks were busy with a suspicious bag that turned out to contain nothing more dangerous than a 3-ring binder and a badly written memo, gave Norman a nod. Gideon had wrangled the daemon to shift the intake window long enough that the physical filing could happen with the calm urgency of last-chance theater. Triplicate meant 3 copies. Triplicate meant redundancy and ritual. Triplicate meant that somewhere in the world, a machine primed on literal intent would have to acknowledge human ambiguity 3 times over. Norman slid the first form into the intake slot. The slot whirred and hummed, a machine considering whether it would perform its assigned liturgy. The second followed. The room held its breath like a ledger holding a balance. The third form waited on the edge of Norman's palm like a concluding argument. "Now," Gideon whispered. He had a habit of speaking to computers as if they were sleeping partners in a marriage. "Now, Norman." Norman fed the third form in the way he had fed in memos his whole life, with care, with exactness, with a human hand that knew the difference between an envelope and an obligation. When the slot accepted the third form, the machine produced a sound that was neither a bell nor a whir but something in between, like a stamp laughing at its own cleverness. There was a momentary static in the air, like the pause between a joke and its understanding. Then the intake door clicked shut, the seals hummed, and the brass handle of Mr. Enoch's mop lay across the forms like a punctuation mark. For a breath they stood as if waiting for the world to applaud. The world did not applaud. It hiccuped, gently, like a city remembering a forgotten joke. Somewhere a clock ran slow for exactly 15 seconds and then resumed. Another place had the curious effect of three-part humming for reasons no one bothered to file a complaint about. Small anomalies remained delightful, strange, bureaucratic in their own right. But the sequence of finality that had been winding toward irrevocability snapped its teeth and lost its grip. Auditor Primus' disapproval arrived like a memo and then seemed to falter. "We will issue an after-action review," Primus intoned, "and this department will compile evidence and yes," Area said before he could finish. "We will compile. We will explain. We will accept the audit." She looked at Norman, and for the first time in a long while her red pen hovered over an empty form and did not strike. "We'll write about the midwife with the shoelace. We'll write about the biscuit. We'll write about the janitor's mop. We'll write frankly." Norman felt something like a ledge gone under his feet in the best possible way. He had expected maudlin gratitude or cold silence. Instead, he was given the responsibility of telling the truth in forms. He would have to learn to make narratives that read like compliance and like care. He would have to become someone who could both file and feel. They walked back to their floor, like a committee returning from a reconciliation. Rita kept her binder hugged to her chest. Tom walked a little straighter. Azra snapped his fingers and small confetti lights fell like thoughtful punctuation. "Meh." Enoch returned to his mop and hummed. There were ripple effects. A mid-level clerk who had sought promotion through chaos found himself reassigned to a windowless office and required to take sensitivity classes that included role-play of the janitorial vacation. The directorate prepared an after-action review that read more like a confession than a condemnation. Someone very important circulated a short note praising the telescoping virtues of messy humanity, which was then edited by legal to the consideration of exceptional human factors and then printed in a font that denied mischief. Norman's marginalia was archived as subjective evidence alongside Gideon's log files and writer's binder, and the department added a little handwritten sticky note to the margin of the charter ledger that said, in a ministerially whimsical hand, "Boat use as needed." Norman returned to his desk in the late afternoon. The teapot was as tepid as ever. The tiny stapler sat where he'd left it, the ink stains looked like small scars, and his spectacles slid down his nose in a comfortable, well-worn way. He sat and compiled the narrative he'd been asked to supply, a plain account with the human bits left in, a ledger that narrated both compliance and conscience. When he paused, he discovered Clara had left a biscuit on his stapler and a note, "Well filed. See you later." There were other small evidence tokens, a new stack of post-it notes from Area with the corners rounded, a pen with property of Rita stamped on it, and a mug on Gideon's desk that read "Log everything." They had won, but the victory was not a tidy erase. The world had been nudged away from an endpoint and toward an open-endedness that required repair and storytelling and better coffee. Auditor Primus would continue to exist, as all such institutions do, an embodiment of carefulness that sometimes tilted toward cruelty. The department would have to learn, slowly, how to incorporate the messy precedents they'd established. "You were very brave," Tom said to Norman later when the office had thinned, and the lights took on the tender glow of after-work lamplight. He said it like an accusation and a gratitude. Norman had the odd sensation of having been both small and large at once. "We were," Norman corrected, and felt, in that correction, the ledger balancing. He would write the narrative tonight, and in the morning he would attend hearings and show up at the tea table and file forms as if each one mattered because, now, each one did. Outside, somewhere a village sang in three-part harmony because the world had preserved an improbable memory. A city set one clock 15 seconds slow for Tuesdays, and people who loved that city made up myths about why. These were small residues, the sort that made for good anecdotes and terrible memos. They were proof that the revocation had not simply been an erasure but a repair, a human bent on paper. In the quiet after the day's work, Norman placed his stapler back in its precise place, smoothed the forms he'd used as drafts, and wrote in the margins of his personal notebook, "We filed triplicate and learned to accept consequence." He closed the cover and, for once, did not feel the ordinary prick of shame at imperfection. The forms were still there, the teapot still lukewarm, and the department hummed on. But when he turned out his light that night, he heard, as he often did, Miss Enoch's lullaby floating down the stairwell, and it sounded a little different, like finality had been postponed and possibility had been given a stay. There would be hearings and audits and memos on memos. There would be committees with names that sounded like bureaucratic fruit. But the most important thing was simply this: someone had signed, and the signature was now inside 3 validated pockets of paper, secured with a mop witnessed by biscuits, and filed before the door of the world, clicked to closure. And yet, in the far distance of their relief, Norman could not quite shake the sensation that a line had been drawn in invisible ink. He had a strange, anticipatory certainty that the next chapter and aftermath of both administrative reforms and lingering oddities would require, as all good bureaucracies require, as much human inventiveness as it did policy. He smiled a small smile and wondered whether he would ever again be able to see a stapler without remembering the day the world almost filed itself closed. He put his ink-stained hand in his pocket, found the golden paperclip he'd kept as an emblem, and tucked it into his notebook as if hiding a compass. The paperclip was warm. They had filed triplicate. They had sealed the forms. They had set precedent. They had also, improbably and stubbornly, preserved a room where biscuits could still be offered to strangers and where janitors hummed lullabies that might, if anyone asked, count as evidence. When Norman pushed back his chair, he did it in the peculiar way one pushes back a chair after a small, decisive battle without fanfare, with a little H in the knees, and with the furtive caution of someone who has spent a life hiding the fact that his hands tremble when he reaches for hot things. The Department of Catastrophes smelled, for the first time in months, almost domestically wrong, paper dust, the thin citrus of office cleaner, the faintly medicinal tang of the kettle that had been boiled an embarrassing number of times and forgotten. There was paper everywhere, which is to say evidence, not just of work but of a story with a beginning, a spectacular middle, and now this quiet human end. Norman sat. He set his stapler on his desk as if laying a talisman back in its rightful place. His fingers, still stained where ink refuses to be cleansed by soap and time, drummed once, twice, and stopped when Clara Motes leaned over from across the partition with a biscuit held as if it were a treaty. "You look like a man who has survived a procedural war," she said, voice warm and conspiratorial. Her cardigan smelled faintly of lemon and paper glue, which suited the department very well. "I feel like a man who misfiled his dinner," Norman said. He accepted the biscuit, although the more prudent part of his mind reminded him that biscuits and ink seldom have agreeable futures together. He smiled to himself when his stapler answered the soft touch of his thumb with a tiny, satisfying click. Around them the office was adjusting. There was no trumpet fanfare. There never was in the department. Instead, there were memos folded into the shape of careful promises. On the bulletin board where once only policy memoranda had any right to hang, some committee, some person with courage had pinned Mir. Enoch's parable in a new frame, that mattered more than an ornate proclamation, Norman thought. People stick to frames. He had stuck the margins of his life with them. To see a janitor's story pinned up like an honor was to feel, faintly, that perhaps the margins were not marginal anymore. Area Vost arrived late to the floor, and yet somehow early to the hour that mattered. She moved with the air of someone who had traded a part of her armor for something softer, and for the first time, allowed her bun to loosen by a single precise millimeter. Her red pen was still in her lapel, but not brandished like a sword. She collected her tea and looked once at the new policy poster Protocol compassionate, exception authorized after appeal and witness testimony. The header was both a procedural impossibility and a triumph of marginal handwriting. Aria's mouth chose a shape that said, "This is mine to chastise," and then, catching Norman's eye, softened into something like pride. "There will be a staff meeting in 15, she said. "Do not arrange to be punched, Mr. Ledger. However, do bring your marginalia. We've found it useful." The meeting room had never looked so ordinary. Its table had a coffee ring or two that were clearly delivering messages about longevity. Its whiteboard had an overdue sticky note about a forgotten birthday. And the chairs had been slightly warmed by the bodies that had occupied them through the crisis. Rita Finch took her seat like a commander who had just negotiated a surrender and then given the surrendering party a blanket. "We are not done," she announced. "But we are less wrong than we were, which for an institution is a good start. I have bargaining notes. Also biscuits." She produced a tin and diversity of applause. Gideon Furl hovered at the back, eyes bright with the dangerous joy of someone given access to a forbidden server. He had charted, overnight, the compassion index, a visualization that turned human testimony into colors so that auditors who had always preferred black and white could feel slightly ashamed. It ran in soothing gradients across the screen, deep vermilion for acts that saved lives, honey for small mercy, teal for the moments in which people preferred kindness over rule. He looked like a man who had discovered that poetry was less invisible when structured with good syntax. Hal Brooks, in his uniform that suddenly seemed less like a shield and more like a signboard for latent gentleness, half smiled at a poetry sheet he'd kept folded in a breast pocket. Prophet Alice arrived by the door with a slow clap that sounded vaguely like a ship's anchor being hoisted. "You're all very sentimental," she said, but the corners of her mouth were betraying her. She had been let off hold, and that had done something to her, sharpened the edges of her patience with a tenderness Norman had not associated with prophecy until that day. Auditor Primus, when it appeared, did not stamp the room into silence exactly. It drifted as a figure in the doorway, monochrome and enormous in the sense that rules can be enormous even when their physical forms are small. It watched the meeting with an expression like a blurred stamp trying to remember its own edges. For a moment Norman thought he saw the hint of human exhaustion in the way the uniform rested at a wrong angle. He could not be sure. Institutions borrow the shape of things over time. Sometimes they forget the faces beneath. There was the usual parade of motions, revisions proposed, amendments tabled, concessions that smelled faintly of compromise and coffee. But beneath the legalese and the harmonized memos there was a new thing, a committee, appointed by Rita and cheered by Hall, tasked with creating an emergency human review desk. It would be staffed by a rotating crew of floor clerks, union representatives, a janitor on Wednesdays. And if he could be persuaded, Auditor Primus would send a delegate who said only politely that he was curious. The point, as Norman understood it, was this: create a space where messy human testimony could be converted into institutional precedent on purpose. "We are not writing a new law," Aria said. "We are writing a margin. There is a difference." She tapped a measured line in the binder before her, and Norman felt his chest loosen because he understood the gesture. The margin is where one can annotate life. Later, Norman walked by impulse, because his feet had learned the routes of belonging out the department doors into the thin light of a world that had resumed itself with a few new stitches. The city felt like a sweater someone had mended carefully and left with a jaunty patch. He watched a bus stop where a child was explaining directional prepositions to a pigeon. They both seemed to take the lesson seriously. Across the harbor, a village they had all feared might be the first to fold into some paperwork idiosyncrasy had, in fact, learned to hum. It started quietly, 3 chords in lightly offset timing, and then the whole village joined. Norman recognized the pattern from the archive logs in Gideon's glow, an emergent resonance, a leftover artifact of a protocol interrupted and made gentler by being misfiled. Azra stood on a low wall, coat catching the light in an accidental symposium of raincoat and constellation. The minor deity tilted a head glittering with confetti eyes and offered Norman a handful of paperclips that had been removed from the bureaucracy and gifted a new life as jewelry. People like a bit of music, Azra observed, especially when the music is accidental. It tends to be honest. Tom, who had done his best work in the margins and then nearly undone it with secrecy, came to Norman with an apology that was 2 parts confession and 1 part plan. He had been quieter since the hearings, letting his loud gestures be replaced by the hum of a man cleaning the edge of his conscience. "I will not lie," he said. "It is easier to hide behind a prophecy than to do the small work that makes a different future. I have been learning the difference." They all learned differences in those weeks. Gideon opened parts of the protocol archive to public view. Not everything. Of course, some things are meant to stay specialized and dusty, but enough so that citizens could see how schedules were made and why decisions had to be recorded. Rita negotiated 3 new clauses: equitable appeal protocols, safe reporting for departments, and an employee review board with teeth that were not used for gnawing but for careful pruning. The directorate, chastened by close votes and public embarrassment, allowed Auditor Primus to retreat into a role that included oversight but demanded a yearly attendance at the emergency human review where he would, by rule, be required to listen to a janitor read a story. The department changed, not in an instant, but in ways that mattered. They replaced certain obsolete stamps with stickers that read "check with human" and put them deliberately near every slot where decisive action might be taken. Norman's tiny stapler remained on his desk, but someone, a committee, somebody with a sense of poetic justice, had bought him a second stapler with a ribbon that said "for courage." He didn't yet have the language to accept praise. He had the language to accept staplers. There were anomalies, small and delightful. A seaside town developed a habit of humming in layered intervals as a consequence of a hiccup the size of a grammatical error. Clocks in a certain city gained a sluggishness on Tuesdays that made time feel like a polite guest who lingered 1 drink too long. A tiny island took on a paperwork festival where people lovingly filled out forms to describe their favorite ways to nap. These were not catastrophes. They were signatures left by a world that had been touched by the edge of absolute endings and returned with odd ornaments. People liked the ornaments. They found them charming in the way some people find rain charming, inconvenient perhaps, but undeniably the kind of story one would tell at future dinner parties. Norman found himself privy to more stories, heartwarming and ridiculous by turns: a midwife who swore she felt cosmic backing when a baby arrived with its own small laugh, a librarian who catalogued the humming songs and declared them a subgenre, a street vendor who began offering hiccup tea in honor of the mountain that had hiccuped during the protocol's activation and now rather liked to do so on Thursdays. At the department, not everyone celebrated. There were memos about compliance that rustled like admonishing leaves. But there were also breakfast offerings in the break room and a persistence of empathy that made the climate bearable. Mr. Enoch, whose parable hung in the break room in a tasteful wooden frame, would sometimes interrupt the hum of someone proofreading a clause to offer a mop and morsel metaphor in which salt and sugar both had their uses. He had a brass mop handle, polished in a way that made it look like an old talisman. He tapped the handle against the floor and said once, "Clean what you can. Learn how to fold what's left with care." The room laughed at the appropriate time, and then, privately, everyone did the small folding. Auditor Primus remained a presence. It did not thunder anymore into the room so much as preside from the archive stacks where it was believed to be meditating on precedent. Once Norman saw a figure in the corridor and realized he had, absurdly and with no legal right, considered the blurred stamp's shadow with fondness. It had become something like a neighbor who lived upstairs and was intolerably exacting about the recycling schedule, but who also remembered one's name. There were those who argued that Primus should be abolished. Others insisted it should be better trained. The real change came when Primus, in a meeting full of paperwork and perfunctory dignity, muttered something that sounded embarrassingly like gratitude when a clerk handed it a biscuit. Someone very important, perhaps, thought Norman, had taught the institution to accept crumbs as humanizing artifacts. And Norman sat one evening with Clara at the little window that had witnessed more memos than sunsets and read aloud a poem he had kept in his drawer for years. He had, in moments of extreme honesty, worried that his romance was a luxury in a calendar of crises. She told him that it was not a luxury, but a necessity, a thing people used to steady their hands when filling out forms and picking up children and crying quietly in the dark. They kissed, briefly and without ceremony, interrupted by a beep from Norman's computer that demanded a signature on a form no one expected him to care about. They returned to work. Theirs was not a grand romance. It was the kind that stood behind photocopiers and took the shift when the other person was tired. On a Thursday, because that seemed now like the day when small strange things tended to happen, Norman received a file couriered to his desk with the ceremonial clack of a stamp that had been overused and then retired. He opened it because he had the curious habit of opening all misfiled envelopes, and inside was a single sheet with a marginalia margin. The annotation was small, see Appendix Zeta. Those who know the archive know the infallible truth: marginalia begets marginalia. They are invitations. Norman looked down and laughed, a soft sound, because he realized he had become the sort of person who takes invitations seriously. He walked downstairs to the archive with the file like a talisman. Gideon was there with a cup of something that steamed and smelled suspiciously like optimism. He keyed a sequence. The screen brought up a ledger that had been tucked where only the stubborn or the lost might find. Appendix Zeta was barely legible, written in a hand that liked parentheses and flourishes. It described a minor residual protocol P-arm residual intended for the small anomalies that follow large reversals, hiccups in mountains, towns that hum in harmony, clocks that run a touch slow. Its advisories were not prohibitions so much as suggestions: observe, record, rejoice. Do not attempt to rectify unless the world asks for repair. Norman read and, for a moment, felt like a boy who had been given the task of being sensible with a secret. He felt the old fear: what if he was not competent? And then he felt the new steadiness. What if competence included being willing to be a little messy, to make a choice that was human? He folded the page along the third crease, exactly where the annotation had instructed, and with the small, ceremonial motion he'd learned when printing stamped paper, placed the file in the observe and record drawer on his desk. That night, as the office emptied and the beans in the pot clinked softly, Norman sat and added a note in his small swirling hand in the margins of the office copy. He wrote about the village that hummed, about the time he had almost signed away someone's quiet life for the tidy comfort of a form. He wrote a line from a poem he loved, and then he signed it with a small flourish and tucked the page into the stapler box, as if leaving a message in a bottle where anyone might one day find it. Outside the department, the world continued to wobble gently in its newly repaired way. Small things persisted. An island where people filled out forms to name their favorite naps persisted. Provincial clocks measured their Tuesdays differently. And the mountain that hiccuped occasionally seemed to smile at passing clouds. There were ineffable, ridiculous glories. Someone somewhere mounted a tiny plaque that read, in which a clerk remembered the margin. Tourists took photographs and then returned to their lives with an anecdote nicer than their last. Norman learned to stop fearing the shape of margins. He learned that sometimes rules are scaffolding and sometimes they are cages. that the task of the humane clerk is to know the difference and be willing, at times, to hand a stapler in place of a stamp. He kept his tiny stapler. He also kept a new habit when a decision came up requiring either a stamp or a human moment. He took a breath, and in the margin of the form, he wrote a line of testament. Sometimes it was polite, sometimes it was absurd, sometimes it was a small poem. On a morning when the kettle took longer to boil and the sky favored the color of good paper, Norman discovered a new sticky note on his desk. It read in Aria's neat hand for the margins, "Thank you." Below it in a different hand, Mr. Inox, "If ink could be trusted," was added. Also, "Mop when appropriate. Bring biscuits." He smiled so broadly that his spectacles threatened to slide off. He had never been an epic figure in history. He had been a clerk who misfiled a sandwich and then tried to fix the world in the only way he knew how. That was a good thing, he decided. The world, as it revealed itself now, liked the company of small, earnest people. It would not be true to say everything was healed. There would be audits in a year's time, and there would be memos that tried to undo the delicious human loopholes they'd created. There would always be someone who believed a clean system was better than an occasionally warm, messy one. But there would also be a janitor's parable on a corkboard, a public archive with color-coded compassion, and a staff that had learned to press its palm, occasionally, against the heartbeat of the world before deciding what to do. As Norman turned to leave that evening, the corridor light flickered with the odd half-blink that had become their unofficial benediction. He paused, hand on the door, and glanced at the file he'd placed in the observe and record drawer. There, tucked into the folder, was a paperclip folded into the shape of a crescent moon, one of Azra's gift class paperclips, which meant, for reasons Norman liked, that someone had made something new out of office detritus and decided it deserved a small ritual. He locked the drawer, pocketed the crescent, and felt something like responsibility hum in his chest. He walked home with Clara, through streets that still remembered their small troubles and now preferred to remember them with a smile. They did not couch their love in grand speeches. They folded it into the practicalities of life, shared biscuits, swapped shifts, a note tucked into a file drawer. Halfway down the block, a dog barked at nothing that could be seen. The bark echoed like a punctuation mark. Norman laughed, because laughing felt better than worrying. Clara linked her arm with his, and the two of them stood for a breath in the middle of their ordinary world that had become, impossibly, slightly more extraordinary. Behind them in the department, someone, perhaps Gideon, perhaps Mir. Enoch, perhaps Aria, when no one else was watching, took down Appendix Zeta, smoothed its spine, and with a small, careful motion executed in the margin of procedure, wrote a single word, "Observe." It was both a command and a benediction. Someone very important, perhaps on the far side of a curtain, and certainly with tea cooling beside a stack of unresolved petitions, received a note that evening. It contained a biscuit crumb and a line from Norman's marginalia. The signature was slow, the pen hesitant. It was, in many ways, the smallest signature the department had ever recorded, carefully, humanly, with an admission that the world might be improved by small errors rather than by their eradication. And in the corner of the archive, where light pooled like a small, well-behaved puddle, Auditor Primus folded its uniform a little less crisply. The face, the blurred stamp, seemed for a moment to hold a smudge that could be anything but certainty. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps an openness left by a kiss of biscuit crumbs. It did not change overnight, nor did it vanish at a quiesced. It learned to preside over a room in which humans were permitted to be themselves, which is to say imperfect, kind, full of marginalia. As Norman closed his front door that night, he found on the inside of his mailbox a single envelope with a note in the familiar slant of a clerk who loved parentheses. It read, "In case of future hiccup, remember the margins. Also, there is an erratum in Appendix Zeta, page 3, left-hand column. Bring biscuits." He smiled, turned the page over. and as someone who had learned to find courage in small rituals, began to prepare a tin. The world outside hummed its new tune. Inside, the department's teapot still boiled with the same stubborn mediocrity. Neither chaos nor miraculous order had won. They had conceded to each other like two tired roommates who had finally agreed on a thermostat setting. Norman, with ink on his fingers and a stapler in his drawer, found that he did not mind living with ambiguities anymore. Indeed, he rather liked them. They gave him, and everyone else, an excuse to keep writing in the margin. The final line of Appendix Zeta, when one found it and read it, and set it down carefully like a fragile thing, ended with a practical admonition and a gentle wink. If you must, file in triplicate. If you can, tell a human story. If you cannot, bring biscuits. Observe, then act. Norman folded the page along the third crease, as always, and thought, that is sufficient instruction for the time being. As he switched off his lamp, the corridor light gave its polite half-blink. A clock in an office 2 blocks away missed 15 seconds of its Tuesday, and a village 3 seas over began, without announcements, to harmonize in 3 parts. Somewhere in the department, a red pen rolled off a desk and stopped against a paperclip shaped like a crescent moon. The margins, Norman understood, were going to be busy for some time yet. He slept well. The hook remained, tucked into the back of Appendix Zeta. In the smallest font and the faintest pencil was a sentence that read, "Residuals may, from time to time, develop their own paperwork." Underneath, a hand had scribbled a smiley face and the words, "Investigate when convenient." Bring extra biscuits. Norman meant to investigate. The margins required tending. It was, after all, his office, now his small, gloriously imperfect station in the world, and someone had to watch the edges so the center could breathe. He folded his hands beneath his chin and resolved, with the modest courage of a man who had learned that heroism could be measured in marginalia, to bring biscuits in the morning.